Hi everyone, and welcome to Philanthropy Impact's Walk in My Shoes series for professional advisors, where today we are discussing the topic of trust in philanthropy. My name is Sophia, and I'm the Director of Membership and Development here at Philanthropy Impact, and also your moderator for the session today. This is a 30-minute session, but we are taking questions, so please use the chat function to introduce yourself and have your say and pose questions to our panel. As always, we ask that you remain respectful to them and to each other. It is my pleasure to introduce our panel today. We welcome Kitty Harris, Head of Business Development at Prism the Gift Fund, as our panel chair today. And joining Kitty, we have Alexander Rhodes, Head of Mishcon Purpose at Mishcon de Reya, Cath Dovey, co-founder of the Beacon Collaborative, and Alex Day, Director of the Big Give. Thank you all for all your time and insight given today, and I will now pass over to Kitty to make us start. Thank you, Kitty.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sophia. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining this session on trust in philanthropy. I'm conscious we have under 30 minutes to explore quite a big topic. So I just wanted to give some context and background for the discussion. There's currently an income shortfall of around £12.4 billion in the third sector. And although philanthropic funding is noted for moving swiftly and flexibly, more so than institutional funding, philanthropists don't necessarily want to plug a funding gap. They want to innovate and be dynamic with their giving. In a report released by Prism earlier this month, the Philanthropy Paradox, we found the public views donations more positively than they do donors. This is a little problematic. We don't want to shun those that give, but encourage those that don't to start, and to educate people to feel responsible to give more, and to give better. Trust in philanthropy is crucial to this. It underpins the third sector and people's desire to do good and to give. And to help us explore this topic, we're joined by an expert panel of speakers. So thank you all for being here. Cath, I'd like to start with you. Charitable giving is a very common but largely private matter in the UK. How can we change this behaviour to improve trust in donors and their donations?
I think there's an enormous amount in that question. And it starts with understanding why philanthropy is a private matter, I think. And, I think historically when people are giving money away, it says something about themselves. You're making, particularly with large gifts, you're making a statement in a way about what you believe in, what matters to you. And with that comes a whole raft of judgments. And I think lots of people prefer either not to give and avoid difficult questions, or to keep it private so that they don't have to tackle those judgments in any kind of public domain. I think, we need a much more sophisticated understanding of the behaviours of donors and why they opt for these behaviour modes before we can start unpicking them and supporting them and, get them onto that very first step of what we all know can be an incredibly rewarding giving journey.
Brilliant, thank you. And Alex, coming to you next, connecting people with platforms is crucial to encouraging giving by providing that solution. Can you please talk us through Alec Reid's philanthropic journey and why he decided to found the Big Give?
Sure. So for those of you who don't know, Sir Alec Reid founded the Reid recruitment business in 1960 in the back of a carpet shop in West London, just as Heathrow was being built. So quite fortuitous, which he would acknowledge himself, and grew the business. Has always been very altruistic and supported and set up a number of charities, including making the Reid Foundation one of the biggest shareholders of the Reid business. So the Reid Foundation owns 20% of the company. In the mid-2000s, as he was handing over the chairmanship of the business to his son, James, he wanted to be more involved with his philanthropy and that for that to be his focus post-retirement. And he felt frustrated at the time that there wasn't anywhere online as a philanthropist where he could search for charities, see which projects they're running, do his due diligence and make a commitment of support. So he tested that idea amongst some of his philanthropic friends. They all felt that was a gap in the market. And so through the Reid Foundation funded the build of the Big Give platform to fulfill that need. So it was launched in 2007, lots of PR behind it, lots of charities registered on the site. Some donations started to come through in that first year, but I guess nothing that matched Sir Alec's ambition for the site. At the same time, him and the other trustees of the Reid Foundation were asking themselves, how can we increase the sustainability of our giving? They were being approached year in, year out from lots of charities asking for the same commitments each year. And so Sir Alec and the trustees said, were asking themselves, how can we make sure that if in year 3, 4, 5, we decide to focus our attention elsewhere, how can we make sure we're not just the kind of cash cow for these organizations, and how can we build sustainability? So for those two reasons, to really kind of kickstart things on the Big Give platform, but also to try and answer this question of sustainability, they opted to put up £1 million of match funding for charities on the Big Give platform to apply for. The deal was anything you donate through the platform at a specific time will be doubled. That proved to be hugely successful. So in that first foray into match funding, the match funding ran out in 45 minutes. And from that point forward, Sir Alec and the team at the time realised there was something very compelling in this match funding offer. So I suppose, to cut a long story short, whilst we still retain that ability to connect philanthropists and charities, most of our energy and effort and focus now is on running match funding campaigns, which we've proved to be a very successful way, both on the kind of demand side from charities of raising funds, but also in the supply side of philanthropy, and a really attractive vehicle for philanthropists to disperse their funds.
Absolutely, hugely inspiring. And I would say that the Big Give starts tomorrow, so everybody, you can get online and see what you can match fund then.
Thanks for the plug.
And Alexander, coming to you, I mean, Cath's obviously mentioned understanding behaviours of donors and why they want to give, but I suppose a reverse question is, are people deterred from giving more money to charity because of negative public perceptions of philanthropists?
I think in my experience, no, I don't think people have been put off giving money, but I do think that people think quite carefully about how they do it. I also think, in answering the question, there's a big difference between people who give large amounts of money, and this also goes to I think some of the findings of the paradox report, and people who give smaller amounts of money. And of course, what Alex has just been saying about the Big Give is so interesting to that point, because it's absolutely at the nexus between the two. Where people who have got a large amount of money who can provide a match service incentivize those who want to give on a more modest scale, like, for example, the Times appeal, Christmas appeal, which is just opened up again. Some of the charities on there have got matches given by large-scale philanthropists to encourage people to give on a smaller scale. And I think that nexus between the amount that people give is quite important, and thinking about how those get characterized. So I think, Kitty, I'd say that, in my experience, people aren't put off giving money because of being characterized as a philanthropist, which is a bad thing and has a stigma attached to it. But people do think quite carefully about how they give. And Cath's point about people giving and giving being a private matter, I think, is very important. Some people give and they want to see their name stuck on the side of a piece of real estate, and that's fine. And some people give and they don't want the right hand to see what the left hand is doing, and they don't want anyone else to see either of their hands. I do think that there are considerations around giving generally, but I don't think that I've come across people who want to give not giving because of that. Okay, and I suppose, Cath, this goes very well with the report that Beacon released earlier this year called The Giving Voice to Philanthropy report, that's available on the website. And this really highlights that there's a distrust of high net worth philanthropy among the public, but that the perception of this arises from a lack of understanding about the motives of high net worth givers and what they really want to achieve. As Alexander said, is it having a plaque and they want their name in lights, or is there a deeper kind of more emotional connection? And how can we overcome that distrust that exists?
So you've got two constituencies here. You've got the general public, and then you've got the individual donors themselves. And this label philanthropist is somewhat exclusive, and it sort of imbues or implies a set of motives that have not really been practiced or written down anywhere. There are no agreed rules of engagement. There's nothing that says this is what a philanthropist is and what it isn't. And I think as a consequence of that, you get quite a lot of misunderstanding and misjudgments that occur. And I think for individuals, as Alexander says, they probably know how they want to give, but would they call themselves a philanthropist? That puts them in a certain sort of exclusive category. And I think what we were saying in the Giving Voice report is that, philanthropy at its best comes from communities, is embedded in those communities, whatever those communities may be, whatever those actions, those causes may be, but it needs to be embedded within them. And what you don't want as an individual is a term that's going to separate you somehow, and that's going to come with all of those misjudgments and misunderstandings aligned to it. So I think the word philanthropist is quite problematic. And I think, to Alexander's point, you will find lots of people who know what they want to do and how they want to do it, but they wouldn't necessarily want to be called a philanthropist in the process. What we're saying in our report was, can we really embed giving in the communities that it's aiming to serve, so that we're all standing shoulder to shoulder, that we're not separating out one group of people from another group of people.
I suppose identifying as part of the pack. I've had another conversation with Alexander about this, that what if everybody was called a philanthropist? Nobody would have a problem with the term. So maybe we need to think of a new term. Alex, coming to you, what are the main challenges for philanthropists and social investors in supporting community-based organisations and small charities? And does trust and transparency affect that process?
So in answer to your first question, I think my experience from the philanthropists that we work with is that there is actually a strong desire to give to smaller and more community-based organisations. I think the issue is lack of awareness, and I think there's issue on both sides there. I think there's issues from the organisations themselves rising above the noise, often very small, or if fundraising teams, if having a fundraising team at all. And also for the ability of those organisations to deliver, I think, what it is perceived that philanthropists want in terms of attracting those sorts of donations, so kind of impact reports, etc., theory of change. So I think there is an issue on the organisational side, but I think on the philanthropist side, again, my experience is that it's not a lack of trying. It's often very time poor people who struggle to filter through the 160,000 charities that exist in the UK and select and find charities that kind of pique their interest. And I think that's why platforms that exist out there, like the Big Give and others, are important in able to highlight those organisations. The median size organisation that we work with is about £500,000 income, which is not not huge but not tiny, but it gives a sense of the kind of organisations that we support. So I don't think trust and transparency is as much of an issue as perhaps we might think it is from our experience. I think that's probably giving as a whole rather than necessarily focused on smaller organisations. But I think it's incumbent on organisations like the Big Give and others to support those organisations to get that information, get the right information to those who needs to give.
And I suppose by having you as that third-party verifier of those organisations, philanthropists have greater trust and the charities are supported in that. So it's a good match. And I suppose to highlight, COVID saw fundraisers furloughed first. So how do we expect to plug this gap with those that are meant to be doing the fundraising not included in the team, and actually they need support and they need education to help improve that. Right. And Alexander, coming to you, we've touched on impact and kind of sorting data out. Impact measurement alongside managing reputational risk, would you say these two things are key to increasing trust in philanthropy?
Yeah, I think that impact is fundamental to philanthropy. I think there's been a huge amount of focus on impact and purpose in business over the last few years, and during this this year particularly, there's been a real focus on purpose in business and the role of business in society, and fundamentally that's driven. And the reputational aspect of that is driven by impact. Are you actually delivering something? And I think in the charitable sector, in the same way as in business, if you choose to achieve something through charitable means or business means, actually being able to demonstrate that impact is fundamentally important. There is a real, it's very interesting to me that when you look at the rankings of trust, and Alex mentioned trust just a moment ago, that trust in charities is still as low as it is, and I find it really, obviously it's very sad, but I find it surprising. Charities, I think, that focus on the impact that they are having, i.e. the outcomes of their activity, I think make a much more compelling case than those that focus on the outputs of their activity, i.e. what they are doing. And certainly from a donor perspective, or a philanthropist perspective, if we're using that language, I think it's really important to show that where you are applying yourself is for an impact, and you can demonstrate and show what that impact is. That where people are suspicious, as it appears, around people's motives in giving, in large donors' motives in giving, if you can show that the impact that you are having is a positive one and is of a certain kind, then that very much supports your giving. If you can't, then that leaves it more opaque and perhaps makes it harder for you to establish the trust that you need to address that issue.
Yeah, I wonder if we need a whole new kind of language to talk about this, and how media picks it up, and how that impacts trust, and actually how we measure impact, and if there is a universal scale. Cath, a question's actually come up directly for you, asking if Beacon Collaborative has done much research into insight from philanthropists, donors, supporters, high net worths themselves in terms of what they prefer to be called. So is the term philanthropy problematic for them?
Again, I'd make the distinction between the term philanthropy and philanthropist. In the research that we did last year, we had 1,300 high net worths in the research study. The most popular terms to describe what they were doing were a charity, donation, and charitable giving. Philanthropy came in behind those. There is no doubt that this is a problematic word. There's a very good question that's popped up in the chat function about cynicism around philanthropy that's in the media. I mean, one of the challenges with making philanthropy a pillar of society is that it is therefore open to scrutiny, as any pillar of society is and should be. But it does mean that individuals who are giving money away are lumped in as part of a much bigger whole, and they are talked about as part of that bigger whole, where their individual activities, may still be very private for very good reasons. And that creates a real challenge, because we have to be able to be transparent enough that we can respond to the criticisms. If you look at any forum, the only way you get accountability is with transparency, and in order to have transparency you have to have openness, and so individuals have to overcome their fear of being public before we can get that level of transparency and accountability. In my view, it's not the language. In my view, it's about understanding what good practice looks like and encouraging more and more people to work within that framework, so that we can respond to some of these criticisms. That's what we can do on our side. On the other side, I think what we need to ask for, and it's the responsibility of our sector to ask for that, is for people to talk with more care about philanthropy and philanthropists, so that we are not conflating these two terms, and that we're very clear about what good practice looks like and what poor practice is, and to really call out only poor practice and not the whole practice itself.
Absolutely, yeah. And Alex, I'm going to ask you a question, but I'm going to preface some data that John's put in, which is that the perspective of a medium gift in the UK of a high net worth individual is just $4,000 a year. So how do we increase that, and how do we encourage people to give? Let's say we had this ideal frame of good practice and bad practice, and how do we make good practice better?
Yeah, I will answer your question, Kitty, but I just wanted to also pick up on a point that I think Alexander and Cath have both made around trust and trust in philanthropy and philanthropists. And I think we perhaps shouldn't be too alarmist around there being a lack of trust in philanthropy or perceived lack of trust. And I think, you know, if you look at Edmund Trust Barometer, which is published every year, there is a global lack of trust in all of the major institutions across the world at the moment. And so perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that this perceived lack of trust exists. And I think it is, you know, we also need to, I wonder whether it's more of a kind of lack of trust in wealth rather than philanthropy and philanthropists. And, you know, we do have to look upstream about where that wealth is created. And there may be questions that are answered there, which will affect people's perception of philanthropists and larger donors. In answer to your question, I don't think there is one kind of silver bullet which can help increase. I think there are lots of things that we can do, particularly those of us who are working with philanthropists every day. I think, you know, one of the things I'm really passionate about is just trying to make it as frictionless as possible and trying to make it as easy as possible. And I think Cath mentioned early on around, you know, trying to get that initial, take those initial steps on people's philanthropic journey. And I think just making that journey from, you know, not starting to those baby steps as easy and seamless as possible, which, you know, that's a great example of how that can be achieved. So yeah, I think frictionless is something I'll keep banging the drum about.
Great. And Alexander, picking up on what Alex and Cath have said, there's been this mention of inequality and perhaps wealth creation having an impact on general levels of trust. But is inequality an issue in this perception of trust with philanthropists? And I suppose, do we need to readdress societal and funding priorities, and whose decision is that to address those issues?
Kitty, we've got 7 minutes. That's not reasonable.
Too big an ask.
What do I think? Look, inequality is a massive problem in society. In my view, alongside climate change, it is the biggest challenge that we have to face. From the wealthy person's point of view, from the very wealthy person's point of view, I think that there is an interesting change that people have to think about. It's an enhancement of a pre-existing condition, which is that you have to explain your position in society and your part of the social contract if you are wealthy, and particularly if you are super wealthy. You know, since the financial crash, we've seen the very wealthy peloton rocket, while we've seen everybody else stagnate. And those people, I think, you know, are going to come under more and more pressure to explain their role in society and why it is acceptable for them to be quite as wealthy as they are. I think it's interesting if you look at the Times again. You know, for years it has published the rich list, and then more recently it has published the taxpayer list and the giving list. Now, I think it's becoming harder and harder if you're on the first list, if you don't appear on the second and the third list, to explain just what you think you're doing in society. And so I do think from a perspective of people who are wealthy, particularly very wealthy, I think the participation in society and the role around philanthropy is very, very important. I think that the point around the challenge of the word philanthropist, I really do believe what you and I were discussing in our previous conversation, is that if everybody considered themselves to be a philanthropist, no one would have a problem with the word. And so I suppose perhaps I'm at slight odds with Cath around the importance of language, because I do think that language is really, really important. I think that giving is part of society, and being part of society is a team game. So I do think that it's important to see how that giving comes together. And I do
just have one more thought. On the one that is a normal one, the other thing I can do.
Alex, I lost the end of your sentence there, but thank you for that. And I think the report that we spoke about earlier, Cath, actually highlights how important community is and that feeling of being a part of something. And Alex, you're talking about purpose and that, you know, wealth is accumulated for that. And if that is where society moves to, perhaps we will see people give more. We've had a comment in the chat, and I suppose this will be our last question, and Cath, I'll direct it at you, which is we actually could have a lot of trust in the sector because everything is public. The Charity Commission is a fantastic resource, but actually we don't necessarily know how to read it all because there isn't a universal language to translate it into what trust looks like. But the question that's come up is, are we actually avoiding the question of why do people with money not give, and rather than it being an issue of trust? It's been called the elephant in the room by our chat.
I think it's an absolutely brilliant question, and thank you to whoever's written that into the chat. I think it's Rick. I think it's brilliant because we know that there are barriers to giving in the UK. Some of those barriers are trust barriers, and Alexander's already talked about them. You know, there is a requirement, I think, for charities to do what in marketing would be called the hygiene factors, to put your numbers out there, to say what your organisation does, why it does it, how it does it, demonstrate good financial management, demonstrate evidence of impact, show financial sustainability. We've talked about all of these things on this call. Those are some of the issues related to barriers of trust. And in the corporate world, you know, marketing teams will be all over those all over those challenges. We know that there's a funding problem in the third sector, which makes that very, very difficult, but it is an achievable goal with the right kind of resource. It is an achievable goal. The set of barriers to giving that are much, much harder and much, much more systemic in the UK are linked to the barriers of fear that individuals feel. And Barclays has done research on this. We've done research on this. You know, there are fundamental psychological barriers around, I'm afraid of losing my money. Can I afford to do this? Can I afford my retirement if I do this? What are my children going to think of me? What's my community going to think of me? You know, we could go on and on and on about those barriers of sort of fear and financial security. The way that you deal with those is to bring wealthy people into your community as a charitable organisation, active engagement, active relationship management. And particularly for high net worth donors particularly, is engaging them with the cause so that they've got that much broader framework of how a bigger gift can contribute to a systemic change. You know, there is a pathway that you could go through that would take people from overcoming their barriers of trust, overcoming their barriers of fear, making their first small gift to the point around, you know, what's the amount of giving up to £4,000. You know, those first few gifts have to be really meaningful. And then putting in place the steps, you know, the active relationship management steps that will take people from those first significant steps to their full career as a philanthropist. And we can map this out. You know, the research exists for us to do this, but we then have to put it into practice. Putting it into practice is a systemic challenge. And that is why culture moves so slowly in the UK. And sorry, Rick, that was a long answer to your question, but absolutely, it is frustrating how long this takes.
Okay, I'm going to cut in now. Sorry, we only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to extend this for a few seconds. This has been an exemplar in how to deal with a complex issue in 30 minutes. And we'll probably sort of follow up with a webinar in the new year about this because it's extremely complex. Cath, Kitty, Alexander, Alex, thank you very much. What I would like you to do is final words of wisdom, 30 seconds. So we'll start with Alex.
I think we should just make sure that we bang the drum about all the good news stories. My fear is that we create a kind of cancel culture, if you like, around philanthropy and only tell the bad news stories. And so, again, for those of us that are working both in that prism of charities and philanthropists, to tell the good news stories of when that works really well and to encourage others along.
Great. Cath.
Philanthropy is a body of good practice around giving. If we can encourage people want to associate with that body of good practice, and if we can start pushing out why that good practice is important, we can start to develop that counterculture, Alex, and hopefully we can start to encourage more individuals to want to associate with the term philanthropist, and we can regain it, and we can make sure that we can grow this whole area with the trust between all parties.
And you would emphasize the role of professional advisors in encouraging their clients and supporting them on their donor journey?
All good practice.
Excellent. Alexander.
I would just encourage people to start. Start small. Take Cath's advice on that. Start small. Start with something meaningful, and think about what it is you're trying to achieve before you send the money out. That's what I would do.
Thank you, Kitty. You've been blessed with a really excellent panel, and you've done a job. Brilliant. Thank you very much. So the final words of wisdom go to you before Sophia closes.
Thank you. I would say talk about it. Ask people, have they given? What do they like giving to? What did they enjoy? We know philanthropy giving does wonderful things for our health, for our stress, for our communities. So just start talking about it.
Great. Thank you very much. That was brilliant. And thank you everyone for the chat questions. That really added a lot of value. So thank you. Sophia.
Yeah, I echo that. Thank you all for your insights today. It was really good. And to everyone in the chat for really sparking the debate. It was on fire today, so thank you. Next week, we are back at the same time looking at systemic change. A great follow on from today, I think. Have a good week and thanks everybody for joining. Bye.
Thank you.